Comrades and friends, I am very grateful for this opportunity which is given to me to deliver the keynote address at this important seminar. In 2008, when the financial sector of much of the capitalist world was facing a very serious crisis because of the collapse of the housing bubble in the United States, the Indian financial sector was relatively unscathed. And when you ask yourself why, the reason lies in the fact that the Indian financial sector was not attached to its international operations as much as is the case in other capitalist countries. What happened in 2008? What basically happened was that you had this bubble because of which asset prices, housing of course, but a whole lot of financial asset prices had increased greatly. They had increased way beyond their genuine values. They had increased greatly. It was a speculative boom. Obviously, it couldn't be sustained. So when the boom collapsed, a lot of financial institutions which had these assets on their balance sheets found that really they were in the red. These assets were referred to as toxic assets. They were not confined only to the American banks and financial institutions. All over the capitalist world, European banks, British banks and so on, they were all really had bought into this and therefore had toxic assets on their balance sheets. But Indian banks were an exception. The total foreign assets of the Indian banks at that time, as a proportion of their total assets, was no more than about 7%, and that too was not because of the public sector banks whose exposure to international assets was extremely limited, but specifically because of the ICICI Bank, which had a somewhat larger exposure. Not only was it the case that the exposure of the Indian banking system to the foreign assets was small, but certainly to the foreign toxic assets was hardly there. Because of which, while the entire capitalist world was suffering from a financial crisis, the Indian financial sector was relatively unscathed. As a result of the financial crisis elsewhere, you actually had governments coming in to support. The Obama administration gave considerable support to the financial sector in order to bail it out. Similarly, in Britain, there was a corresponding amount of government support by the Conservative government to the banking sector, particular banks, in order to bail them out. In many places, of course, bailing out was not always successful. Lehman Brothers, very well-known financial firm, very old, ancient and well-known financial firm, collapsed. But on the other hand, the financial sector in the advanced capitalist world remained more or less intact. It was saved. Quite often because of the bailing out, as a price of bailing out, the government nationalized some of these banks. For instance, the Royal Bank of Scotland was nationalized in return for the support that the government had got. What that crisis had demonstrated is really an old proposition, that in the market, if you leave things to the private players in the market, they never distinguished between enterprise and speculation. They get entangled in speculation because they can get very high profits for some time at least. And if they get entangled in speculation, in that case, they face collapse when the speculative bubble bursts. And when that happens, it's the common people, it's the depositors who really have to bear the brunt of that collapse. Therefore, the point of nationalizing these, the state taking over some of these distressed banks, was to make sure that these banks do not in future operate in such kinds of speculative activities. So it was recognized all over the capitalist world that really some kind of state control and state supervision over the financial sector is essential to prevent the financial sector from committing the blunders of entering into speculative bubbles and thereby endangering the deposits of the small depositors. So the fact that the private sector is not really the best judge of financial activities is something which was recognized at that particular time. Of course, when the crisis got over, when the financial sector got out of the crisis, once more you had the government withdrawing and of course the financial sector being left to itself to manage its activities. Though of course in the process there has not been a similar bubble because once bitten twice shy, and therefore they don't want to really promote that kind of a bubble anymore. But the point is that exposing the Indian financial sector to foreign financial companies is one that is opening up of our economy, opening up of our financial sector to international level, to international transactions, to acquiring foreign assets, and also making it possible for it to engage in speculative activities. Now, this is something which would be a completely new development as far as Indian finance is concerned. It would be a disastrous development, and I find it very strange that the Reserve Bank of India and the central government is not really putting its foot down on such activities. Instead, it is encouraging, it is okaying the takeover by foreign financial companies of our banking system. The strength of our banking system demonstrated in 2008 lay in the fact that it was not international. It lay in the fact that it really did not prioritize speculation over enterprise. Both those strengths of our banking system are now being compromised by the policies of the central government and of the Reserve Bank of India. I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow, but this makes it open for our financial system to be linked internationally and, of course, to be much more engaged in speculative activities at the international level than has been the case until now. Now, the point is, this is, however, a continuation of a certain trend which has been going on for quite some time. And that trend can be summarized as follows. Credit represents command over capital. If credit is command over capital, then where credit goes represents, in a sense, the whole direction of policy of the direction of movement of an economy. The region-wise distribution of credit, the borrower-wise distribution of credit, the activity-wise distribution of credit determines roughly the trajectory of a country's economic development and therefore its social development. Because the distribution of credit determines the country's direction of social development, it was accepted in India for a very long time that therefore society must control the distribution of credit. And therefore, there was first an attempt at what is called social control over banks. Social control over banks did not work out, and therefore in 1969 you had the nationalization of major banks. There was a second round of nationalization later, but the whole purpose of nationalization was to make sure that actually the direction of credit, activity-wise, borrower-wise, region-wise, is something which must be socially controlled. And the best way of exercising social control was by nationalizing the banks. As a matter of fact, it is something which this was an old idea. Rudolf Hilferding, writing in 1906, his famous book Finance Capital, on the basis of which Lenin wrote his theory of imperialism, had actually argued that the top 6 Berlin banks must be nationalized. That according to him, the essence of socialism consisted in taking over the banking sector, and that the top 6 Berlin banks should be nationalized. So the idea that really the banks which control the direction of credit and therefore command over capital should be socially controlled is an old idea. This idea was there in India, and this idea was put into effect through bank nationalization, which had very important consequences. It had the consequence of actually making credit available to a large segment of borrowers who wouldn't have got anything otherwise. In the old days, if you remember, every monopoly house had its own bank, because it was, as it were, its pet bank, so that it financed the activities of the companies belonging to the monopoly house. It was generally propagated in the pre-independence period that farmers, peasants can't be given institutional credit. Why? Because, they are a sort of unorganized category. How can a bank-like institution, how can it follow up the use of credit? How can it follow up the recovery of loans and so on? And therefore, this is something which is outside the sphere of the institutional banking system. When I was an undergraduate student of economics, we used to write tutorials in my college in which the question was, discuss why agriculture cannot be given institutional credit. And therefore, we had to mention all these arguments. As a matter of fact, bank nationalization in India really changed all that. You actually had banks giving credit to small borrowers, to farmers, which is what made the Green Revolution possible, and so on. And a very significant proportion of bank loan was earmarked for this priority sector lending, and of course a very substantial part of the credit needs of the unorganized sector and peasant agriculture was met from the banking system. Now that is something which was a remarkable development. But on the other hand, that development is something which has been getting undone over a period of time, ever since the introduction of neoliberal economic policies in the country. We still have rules about priority sector lending, but on the other hand, the definition of the priority sector is now so large and so loose that you don't actually have to give any loans to the productive, to the peasant producers. For instance, when I used to be in Kerala, in the old days when I was in the planning board, I was working in the planning board, I would travel around and I would sometimes go and meet some bank employees and I would ask them, so how much priority sector lending have you been doing? So they would say, You know, we meet our norms. We meet, these were nationalized banks. We meet our norms. But between you and me, for the last 18 months, we have not given a single loan which is really can be considered for promoting peasant production or priority sector production. You buy a scooter, then of course the loan, you belong to a rural area, you buy a scooter, the loan given by the bank for that is counted as priority sector lending, and so on. So that, you know, the definition of the priority sector was broadened so much that actually, you know, the institutional lenders, that is the banks, they wash their hands of the unorganized sector. Recently, the All India Democratic Women's Association carried out a kind of survey. They surveyed 9,000 women who had, you know, to look at their credit status and what had happened to their credit needs and so on. And it turns out that these women, they don't get a single paisa of institutional loan. The State Bank of India and so on completely said no to giving any loans to them. What they do instead is to give loans to NBFCs, non-bank financial companies, and to microfinancing institutions. These non-bank financial companies and microfinancing institutions in turn go and give loans to these destitute women. The loans that the non-bank financial companies and MFIs get from banks, the interest rate they pay is about 10%. The interest rate they charge on the loans given to the destitute women is about 26%. So in effect, the kind of thing that the moneylender, village moneylender used to do in the old days, and many of the village moneylenders actually got their funds from the banking system. The kind of thing the village moneylender used to do in the old days is now being done by the NBFCs and the MFIs. So in effect, we are really back to the old system, where the banks, despite even nationalized banks, private banks, of course, forget. The ICICI Bank had openly declared that we would not really have anything to do directly with the borrowers. We would operate through intermediaries or operate through agents. But even the nationalized banks like the State Bank of India now don't even touch borrowers like the destitute women who go there, but on the other hand, they actually operate through NBFCs and MFIs. The loans they make to the NBFCs and MFIs are loans that are counted as priority sector lending. And therefore, these companies, they get loans at extremely low rates, and they get loans on a priority basis from the institutional sources of finance in order to make this finance available to destitute women at much higher rates of interest, and of course with very, very repressive terms and conditions under which they enforce these loans. Now, therefore, the privatization of the banking system had been going on for quite some time. The neoliberal turn in India's economic policy had in a sense undermined, had in a sense sabotaged the fundamental social role that banks were supposed to occupy for quite some time. Not fully, but to a very significant extent. But on the other hand, now that is being carried one step further. In fact, that's now being carried where you have international operators coming and taking over banks, and of course, as I said, thereby making our depositors vulnerable both to the international operations of these and to the speculative operations of these. You see, the point is that suppose a bank, why does a bank operate in a speculative manner? It does so because the rates of return in doing so are much greater. Of course, speculation implies a certain risk, and because of that risk, as long as the rates of return compensate for that risk in their perception, they are perfectly willing to finance speculative activities. Speculative activities, of course, the most fundamental speculative activity is with regard to asset prices, that is, claims on asset prices, and therefore speculation is a rampant phenomenon in advanced capitalism, where, of course, you have stock market valuations being very closely linked with speculation. But the point is that even though they get higher returns by engaging in speculative activities, the depositor does not. The depositor gets the same deposit whether that deposit is being used by the bank for financing an enterprise, financing the Green Revolution, or financing some speculative activity, financing an asset price bubble. So when the bubble collapses, that depositor gets hurt. So it's a very peculiar situation where the depositor does not gain from the gains of the banking, if the gains that a bank makes from its speculation, but the depositor gets hurt when the bank is affected by the losses from speculation. It is to avoid this that there was government oversight, there was RBI oversight to ensure that banks do not engage in this, that basically the financial sector does not engage in this. Now, it is that which is being given up. Until now, under neoliberalism, we had foreign institutional investors coming in and investing here and taking their money out, which itself represented that meant that the economy was subject to fluctuation. At the moment, as you know, the exchange rate of the rupee is depreciating. Why? Because of the fact that a lot of the institutional investors are taking their funds out. So by allowing foreign capital to flow in and out of the country, in any case, you are making the economy vulnerable to the kind of whims and caprices of a bunch of international financiers. But now, even the banks are now going to be, if they are foreign owned, the banks now are also going to be open to that kind of speculative activity. So the entire economy, instead of being geared towards promoting enterprise, promoting particularly small producers, safeguarding them by providing institutional credit as opposed to leaving them to the depredations of the money lenders, would now be geared towards international speculative activities. And what do we gain from it? In other words, this is obvious, this is so obvious, but then the question arises that why is the Reserve Bank doing it? Why is the government doing it? Is there any possible gain? Are they going to bring in some new technology? Nothing of the sort. As a matter of fact, countries fight to ensure that their sovereignty is not compromised, that their financial sovereignty is not compromised. In the immediate post-war period, say in the 1950s, when the Bretton Woods system was set up and the dollar was the reserve currency, American companies used dollars to buy up European companies. And therefore, you actually found a substantial number of European companies changing hands, being taken over by American companies. Against that, there was a huge noise, huge noise all over Europe. There was a man called Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber who wrote a book called The American Challenge. He was a presidential candidate in France at a certain point of time. So there was a huge noise about the fact that the Americans were taking over European business. But here, when it is the case that our banking business is being sought to be taken over by international operators, and that too with the connivance of the central government and the Reserve Bank of India, there is no noise. In fact, this is something we should be acquiring a massive amount of opposition. I'm very glad that comrades here are organizing this seminar and raising their voice against it. But the whole country should be raising its voice against it, because we don't want our financial sector to be taken over by international financiers, all of whom are not averse to engaging in international speculative activities. Therefore, it is important that we fight this tendency. It's important that we resist this, and of course, we bring, this is a neo-fascist government, it's not going to listen to us, but we raise sufficient popular pressure so that the government is forced to rethink the kind of position it has been doing on position it has been taking on foreign ownership of Indian banks. This government's insensitivity is very clear in the fact that an international criminal whom the International Court of Justice has actually branded as an international criminal, the Israeli finance minister, comes here and shakes hands with our finance minister and signs deals and so on. That shows the extent of insensitivity of this government. But if we can actually mobilize substantial amount of public opinion and support on this, I'm sure we would be able to force a change in the situation. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.